Fenwick House. Part 1 Before lunch. The morning Margaret Holloway was discarded, the sky over Millbrook looked the color of wet ash. A low February ceiling pressed down on the rooftops like a hand trying to keep something quiet. The oak trees along Chambers Street stood bare and black against it, their branches reaching upward the way old fingers do when there is nothing left to hold. At 76, Margaret stood on the front porch of the house where she had spent 38 years cooking dinners. No one thanked her for folding laundry. No one noticed was folded, paying bills on time so that comfort could continue looking effortless. She had raised a son in this house. She had buried a husband from it. She had scrubbed the kitchen floor the night before his funeral because guests were coming and the grout near the stove had started to yellow. Now a single suitcase rested beside her orthopedic shoes. It was brown, scuffed at the corners, the kind of luggage a woman buys once and never replaces because she never expects to need it in a hurry. The front door stood half open behind her, letting the warm air from inside leak out into the cold, and the wind took it without asking the way everything had been taken from her this morning. Her son James would not look her in the eye. He stood on the second step down from the porch, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other rubbing the back of his neck in that way he had done since childhood, whenever a lie was forming behind his teeth. He was 53 now, broad-shouldered with the soft middle of a man who had traded ambition for routine and called it success. "Mom," he said, "this isn't what you're making it into." Margaret kept one gloved hand on the suitcase handle. The leather was cold, even through the wool. "Then tell me what it is." His wife answered instead. Brenda always did when things got uncomfortable. She had a talent for stepping into silence and filling it with the kind of words that sounded reasonable if you did not listen too carefully. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded tight across her coat, and her face wore the particular expression of a woman who had rehearsed her compassion in front of a mirror. "It's practical," Brenda said. "This house has stairs everywhere. You fell twice last winter. We both work. We can't keep doing this." As if Margaret had become a spill no one wanted to clean. James sighed through his nose. "We found a place that can take you temporarily." "A place," Margaret repeated quietly. "A senior facility," Brenda said, and the words landed with the blunt force of a door slammed on fingers. "Until something permanent is figured out." Margaret looked past them into the hallway where family photographs still hung on the wall. Her wedding portrait, the white dress she had sewn herself, because the shop version cost 2 weeks of groceries. James at 10, with a missing front tooth, grinning so wide you could see his soul. Christmas morning, 1991, the year she had paid for gifts with overtime shifts and skipped her own doctor visits so the insurance deductible would not crush them in January. The hallway was a museum of her labor, and none of it seemed to belong to her anymore. She looked at her son and waited. She had learned decades ago that silence made honest men speak and dishonest men fidget, and she wanted to know which one was standing in front of her. James fidgeted. Then he said the sentence that would split the day in two. "You have to go by noon." For a second, Margaret thought she had misheard. Her hearing was not what it used to be. The left ear had been fading since the winter she caught that infection and never quite recovered. But humiliation, she discovered, has a sharp and perfect sound. It does not need volume. It arrives at the frequency of a bell struck once in an empty church, and everything after it rings. She gave one slow nod. "I see." Behind Brenda, through the gap in the doorway, Margaret caught a glimpse of the kitchen table. On it sat a stack of unopened envelopes, medical bills, the kind that come in aggressive white with red lettering along the edge. They were not addressed to Margaret. The name on them was Brenda's. And Brenda's hand, Margaret noticed now, was gripping the door frame harder than necessary. her knuckles pale, her jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with stairs or senior facilities. Margaret filed this away without comment. She picked up her suitcase. By 10:30, she was sitting in the office of Henry Caldwell, the only attorney in Millbrook old enough to remember her mother's people. The room smelled like paper and dust and cold coffee that had been reheated once too often. A radiator clicked against the wall in an unsteady rhythm, as if even the building's heart could not decide whether to keep going. Margaret sat straight-backed in a cracked leather chair, with her suitcase beside her knees because posture was the last territory she could defend. Her coat was buttoned to the throat. Her gloves were still on. She looked like a woman on her way to somewhere important, rather than a woman who had just been told she had nowhere left to be. Henry Caldwell entered carrying a file box and a ring of keys. He was 81, thin as a fence post, with white hair combed back in the style of men who had stopped updating their appearance around the time Kennedy was shot. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear and careful, the eyes of a man who had spent 60 years reading contracts and human faces with equal suspicion. "Mrs. Holloway," he said gently, setting the box on his desk, "I'm sorry for the timing of all this." "The timing," Margaret said, "appears to be the only thing in my life still working efficiently." A sad smile crossed his face. He opened the box carefully and removed a folder held together with a rubber band so old it had nearly fused to the paper. "Your grandmother, Dorothy Fenwick, left instructions many years ago. The estate was small and one parcel was tied up in county recording errors that took decades to resolve. We finally cleared the last one." He paused. 6 days ago, in fact." Margaret blinked. "My grandmother died when I was 12. "She did. But she left something specifically in your name to be transferred when the title issue was resolved. Not if, when. She seemed certain it would happen eventually." From the corner of the room came a short, dry laugh. Brenda had insisted on coming to help, which in her vocabulary meant to supervise, which in Margaret's vocabulary meant to make sure no one offered the old woman anything valuable enough to complicate the eviction. James sat beside his wife, silent and tired, already wearing the face of a man who regretted being there but lacked the courage to leave. Henry slid a yellow deed across the desk. Margaret read the words once, then again. A parcel of land out near Blackstone Ridge, a name she had not heard since childhood. Nearly forgotten. No mention of money, no investment account, no comfortable late-life rescue. Just acreage in an old structure listed as residential unoccupied. Brenda actually snorted. "That's it." James leaned over Margaret's shoulder. "What even is that place?" "An old homestead," Henry said, "mostly untouched for decades." Brenda shook her head the way people do when reality has failed to meet their lowest expectations. "So she gets a dead piece of dirt." Margaret kept reading. "There's also a house key," Henry said, placing a rusted key in her palm. The metal was so cold it felt almost alive. "And some surviving documents." Brenda gave a laugh that was meant to sound light but landed cruel. At her age, what is she supposed to do with land plant tomatoes? "Karen," James muttered, and then caught himself because he had almost called his wife by the wrong instinct. The instinct to quiet her, which he rarely followed through on anymore. "No, really," Brenda continued, "this is exactly what I was afraid of. She's going to romanticize this and make everything harder. Mrs. Holloway, you can't live on some abandoned property in the middle of nowhere." Margaret closed her fingers around the key until the teeth pressed into her palm through the glove. The pain was small and specific, and it belonged to her. Henry said quietly, "The property may carry significance beyond its market value." Brenda rolled her eyes. "That is lawyer talk for worthless." James finally looked at his mother. "Maybe we could just sell it fast. Use the money for the facility." The facility. Not her life, not her wishes, not her future. The facility as if she were a shipment that needed a warehouse. Margaret lifted her head. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that everyone in the room had to lean in to hear it, and that small act of leaning, that involuntary gravity, was the first power she had felt all morning. "My grandmother remembered me," she said. "That is already more than I can say for some people in this room." Silence dropped across the office like a sheet thrown over furniture in a house being closed for the season. Brenda straightened. James looked at the floor. Henry folded his hands and waited. Brenda recovered first. "That's unfair." "No," Margaret said, rising slowly from the chair. Her knees protested. Her back sent a familiar wire of pain along the left side. She rose anyway because standing is a decision, and she had just made one. "Unfair was being told to leave my home before lunch." James stood too. "Mom, don't do this." She looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at a word you have read 1,000 times and suddenly realize you have been mispronouncing. She did not see the boy she had raised. She saw a man who had learned how to let comfort make his choices for him, and who had mistaken that habit for wisdom so long that it had become his face. "What I will not do," she said, "is hand over the last thing ever given to me with love just because you have decided I am too old to matter." Henry slid the papers back into the file and stood. "Mrs. Holloway, I can drive you out there this afternoon if you would like." Brenda laughed one final time, soft and aimed. "To what a collapsing shack in a field nobody wants." Margaret picked up her suitcase with one hand and the old key with the other. She held both as if they weighed exactly the same, because in that moment they did. "I suppose," she said, "we are about to find out." She walked out of the office and into the hallway where the fluorescent light buzzed overhead, with the patience of something that had been ignored for years and no longer cared. Pastor Lloyd Baines was standing by the water fountain. He was 65, tall, gray at the temples, with the kind of measured posture that made people trust him before he spoke. He wore his clergy collar under a navy overcoat and held a small Bible in his left hand, the way some men hold a business card, always ready, always positioned to be noticed. James had calmed him. Margaret knew this the way she knew most things about her son's strategies, not because he told her, but because the pattern was too obvious to miss. "Margaret," Baines said, warmly stepping forward, "James mentioned you might be going through a transition. I just wanted to say that sometimes the Lord arranges change for us so that we might find peace in a new season." Margaret stopped. She studied his face the way she might study a crack in a ceiling, trying to determine whether it was surface damage or structural. "A new season," she repeated. "There are wonderful communities," he continued, "places where you would be cared for, where you could rest." He smiled. "At your age, peace is a gift worth accepting." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the Bible in his hand, and the collar at his throat, and the polished shoes that had never once walked a road they did not choose. "Pastor," she said, "the last time someone told a woman to accept her place quietly, it was not God speaking. It was convenience wearing a collar." Baines's smile did not disappear so much as freeze the way water does at the exact moment it becomes ice, still shaped like something liquid but suddenly incapable of movement. Margaret walked past him without another word through the front door and into the February air where Henry Caldwell's Buick was already warming at the curb. The road out of Millbrook curved through fields gone pale with winter, past shuttered barns and mailboxes leaning at angles that suggested exhaustion more than neglect. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her suitcase at her feet and her grandmother's rusted key tucked inside her coat pocket, where it pressed lightly against her ribs every time the car hit a bump, like a second heartbeat reminding her it was there. For the first 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was the kind given to people after funerals, after diagnoses, after a door closes behind them for the last time. Margaret watched the town she had served for most of her life slide away behind bare trees and gray fences, And she thought about how strange it was to watch a place you had loved become simply a place you were leaving. You don't have to go today, you know, Henry said, keeping both hands on the wheel. I can book you a room at the inn for a night or two. Margaret smiled faintly without turning her head. And do what in town? Sit somewhere respectable, while everyone whispers that James Holloway finally put his mother away. Henry let out a breath through his nose. People will talk either way. Yes, she said, but I would prefer they have to work harder for it. That drew the ghost of a laugh from him, and for a moment the car felt less like a vehicle carrying a displaced woman and more like a vessel carrying two old people who still understood how humor worked in the face of ruin. She folded her gloved hands in her lap and let the miles pull the story out of her. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the quiet, factual way that wounded people describe what happened to them when they are too tired to perform the grief. After Robert died, James had told her she should move in temporarily, just until she figured out the bills, the repairs on her own smaller place across town, the logistics of widowhood that no one prepares you for. Temporary became sensible. Sensible became expected. Expected became invisible. Before long, she was no longer a grieving widow helping her son's family. She was just there, setting out breakfast, folding towels, waiting for rides to the pharmacy, apologizing for taking up space in a room she cleaned herself. And then the language changed, not out loud at first. It never starts out loud. Brenda began saying things like, "You don't need to bother," when Margaret reached for dishes after dinner, and the word bother carried a weight that had nothing to do with dishes. Then it became, "Please don't move things around," even when Margaret was only putting groceries in the places they had always gone. James started discussing weekend plans over her head as if she were furniture that happened to be sitting at the table. Her medications became a lot to keep track of. Her careful questions became confusion. Her tiredness became decline. One icy morning last January, she had slipped on the back step carrying in laundry. She did not break anything. She caught herself on the railing, bruised one knee, and sat on the cold step for a full minute before standing again. But Brenda had arrived at the urgent care center that afternoon with the expression of a woman who had just been handed proof, and from that day forward, the word fall was used in every conversation about Margaret's future like a verdict that had already been delivered. Margaret turned toward Henry. "Do you know what the worst part is?" He glanced at her. "What?" "It was not the leaving." Her voice stayed level, but only because she had spent a lifetime learning how to keep it there the way a levee holds. Not because the water is calm, but because the concrete has no choice. It was how prepared they were for it. Brenda had brochures. James had a list of facilities ranked by monthly cost. They had already discussed which pieces of my furniture could be sold and which were not worth the trouble. They had a plan for my bedroom before they told me I was no longer welcome in it. The car hummed over cracked pavement, fields stretched on both sides empty and patient. Henry said, "I am sorry, Margaret." She looked back out at the passing land. "No, you are not the one who needed to be." They stopped for coffee at a roadside gas station with flickering lights and a bell over the door that rang too cheerfully for the hour. Henry bought black coffee for himself and tea for Margaret without asking. He had known her long enough to remember. They stood beside the car while the wind pushed at their coats. The sky had not brightened. If anything, it had darkened slightly, as if the day itself were losing interest in pretending. "Did you know your grandmother well?" Henry asked. "Not well enough," Margaret said. "She died when I was 12. But I remember her hands, strong hands. She never touched anything timidly." Henry nodded as if that meant something specific to him. "She came into my father's office once. I must have been 7, 8. I remember it because she told my father something I never forgot." He paused. She said a woman ought to have one place on this earth that nobody can take from her. Margaret turned toward him slowly. She said that she did. Something moved inside Margaret then. Not hope exactly, because hope felt too young and bright for a woman who had been set out with a suitcase before noon. But something older, something steadier, a single coal still holding heat under a pile of ash everyone else had declared dead. Back in the car, the road narrowed. Trees thickened. The town disappeared. Henry cleared his throat. There is one more thing. What is it? When the county finally released the parcel file, I found old correspondence attached to it. Notes mostly incomplete, but enough to suggest your grandmother fought very hard to keep that property from being absorbed into a neighboring tract. Absorbed by whom? I do not know yet, but there is something else. The county recently appointed a new assessor named Ray Fulton. He has a reputation for being flexible with developers. If he evaluates the land before we understand its full value, it could complicate things considerably. Margaret felt the key in her pocket again. Cold, solid, waiting. Henry slowed the car as pavement gave way to gravel bordered by brush and winter-dead weeds. Ahead, beyond a crooked fence line and a stand of dark pines, she caught the first glimpse of the land no one wanted. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, "Maybe they did not just write off my life." Henry looked at her. "What do you mean?" Margaret kept her eyes on the distant property. "Maybe they wrote off hers first." The gravel road ended at a gate that leaned so far to one side it looked exhausted by the effort of standing. Henry parked beside a fence half swallowed by dead vines and cut the engine. Ahead of them, the property lay under a colorless sky, as if the world itself had forgotten to finish painting it. What had once been a front drive was now two faint wheel ruts through waist-high grass. The land rolled outward in uneven patches, wild and neglected and silent in a way that did not feel peaceful. It felt abandoned on purpose. Margaret stepped out before Henry could come around to open her door. Her boots touched the frozen ground and something in her face changed. Not softer, sharper. More alert, the way a woman looks when she steps into a room and knows instinctively that something is wrong before anyone tells her. The house stood at the far edge of the clearing like a body that had refused to lie down. It was smaller than she expected and in worse condition than Brenda's laughter had suggested. The porch sagged in the middle. One shutter hung at an angle. Half the windows were clouded with grime, and the other half were dark and empty, like eyes that had stopped watching years ago. Beyond it stood a barn with part of its roof caved in, and a smaller outbuilding nearly lost in brush. No manicured garden, no hidden mansion, no miracle waiting in the wings. Just a forgotten property that no sensible person would choose. Henry spoke gently. "I know it is not much to look at." Margaret kept her eyes on the house. "That depends on whether one is looking at what it is or what happened to it." The key took 2 tries. The lock resisted the way old secrets do, with stiffness and friction, and the quiet suggestion that some things were closed for a reason. Then, with a hard scrape and a sudden give, the front door opened inward, and the smell hit first. Dust, damp wood, rooms that had been breathing nothing but themselves for years. The front hall was narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper that might once have been blue. A coat peg still held one bent wire hanger. Beyond it sat a parlor with a stone fireplace blackened by years of cold. A rocking chair rested in the corner with one arm split clean through. Everything wore the same gray skin of time. Margaret stepped inside. Her shoes stirred dust across scarred floorboards. The room was empty in a way stripped places are empty. Not naturally, but after things have been taken. Still, not everything was gone. A chipped enamel bowl sat on a side table. A curtain tie had been looped neatly, though there were no curtains left to hold. On the mantel, a square of cleaner wood showed where a framed photograph had stood for years before being removed. This house was cleared out, Henry said quietly, but not carefully. Margaret turned slowly, taking in the room, the kitchen beyond the faint hall, leading to what must have been 2 bedrooms. No, she said, carefully enough to remove what mattered. He studied her. You see that already? I see absence, she replied. Women do. In the kitchen, the sink was stained deep brown. A cracked dish rested upside down on the counter as if someone had meant to come back for it and never had. Near the back wall, Margaret stopped. She pointed with one gloved finger. Along the baseboard beside the pantry door were shallow marks in the wood. 3 short lines, then a gap, then 3 more. Repeated, even, too precise to be accidental. Henry crouched. Could be from furniture. No, Margaret said, her voice dropping. Too even, too deliberate. She moved down the hall. In the first bedroom, the ceiling had sagged but held. In the second, a narrow iron bed frame remained, and beside it, an old brass hook had been fixed unusually low on the wall. Not at coat height, lower, near where a child might reach or someone seated. Margaret touched the hook. Her fingers lingered there. Then her eyes traveled to the window where the view opened toward the tree line and the road beyond, hidden enough for privacy, close enough to watch anyone approaching. She whispered, not just a home. Back in the parlor late afternoon, light slanted through the dirty panes. Near the hearth, something caught her eye. A small wooden sewing box tucked partly beneath the broken rocking chair. She bent slowly, picked it up, brushed away the dust. The lid was warped but not latched. Inside lay a few rusted pins, 2 pearl buttons, and a tiny key. Brass, narrow, worn smooth at the teeth as if someone had used it often and hidden it carefully. It was far newer than the key to the front door. Henry stared. That was not in the inventory. Margaret held the small key in her palm and looked around the ruined room again, and this time she was not seeing wreckage. She was seeing architecture. She was seeing intention. This place was not forgotten, she said. It was closed. Henry lit 2 battery lanterns from his trunk, and by the time the weak yellow glow spread across the parlor, the house had taken on a different kind of silence. Less abandoned, more watchful, like a room that knows someone has finally come back. When a woman hides one key inside another life, Margaret said, turning the small brass key in her fingers, she usually has a reason. The pantry door was warped, its paint cracked into thin scales. The brass key slid into the lock built into the latch plate, as if it had been waiting. Margaret turned it. The lock clicked open with such ease it felt almost intimate, a greeting between 2 halves of a secret separated by decades. The shelves were mostly bare, dust rings, a broken Croc newspaper laid flat to line the wood. Then Margaret stepped closer to the back wall and ran her hand along the paneling. One board moved. It had been cut more neatly than the rest, its grain aligned to disappear unless you knew where to press. She pushed. A narrow panel shifted inward, revealing a hidden cavity between the studs. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She drew it out with both hands and laid it on the kitchen table. The cloth crackled as she unwrapped it. Inside were letters tied with faded blue ribbon, 1 leather notebook, and a flat envelope sealed with wax, so old it had gone almost black. Henry stared. This was not forgotten. No, Margaret said quietly. It was kept. She lifted the top letter. The paper trembled in her fingers. The handwriting was strong, slanted, the hand of someone who had written not for beauty, but for survival. If you are reading this, it means they failed to bury everything. Margaret read the line again slowly. Something moved down her spine. Not fear, recognition. Not of the words, but of the mind behind them. Her grandmother had not hidden recipes or sentimental scraps. She had hidden testimony. Records already altered. People in town who preferred that certain women vanish quietly, and the places that protected them vanished too. A knock at the back screen door. Both of them turned. An old man stood outside, half-shadowed in the lantern glow. He wore a quilted coat and a cap pulled low, and his face had the weathered, deep-lined look of someone who had spent 70 years outdoors in a county that had never once made his life easy for it. He was black, and he stood at the door with one hand lifted, as if apologizing for existing, which told Margaret more about the history of this town than any document in the box. Henry opened the door a cautious few inches. "Can I help you?" The man peered past him and stopped when he saw Margaret. "You're a Fenwick." It was not a question. Margaret stepped forward. "My grandmother was Dorothy Fenwick." The old man removed his cap. "Then I figured right." He swallowed. "Name is Cecil Marsh. My father worked the adjoining timber line before the county redrew half these parcels to favor the men with money." His eyes moved slowly around the room, reading it the way you read a place you have not seen in years but never stopped thinking about. "Did not think I would ever see someone come back." "Come back to what?" Margaret asked. Cecil hesitated. The hesitation was long enough to show fear or old loyalty or both. He glanced toward the road, though there was nothing to see but dark. "This place was not just a homestead," he said. "Women used to come here at night, sometimes with children, sometimes alone, sometimes bleeding. Your grandmother took them in, fed them, hid them until morning or longer." The room went completely still. Henry looked at the letters on the table, then at the marks they had seen along the baseboard, the brass hook fixed low on the wall, the stripped rooms that had been emptied of everything except what had been hidden too well to find. Margaret's throat tightened. "From whom were they hiding?" Cecil answered in the plain voice of a man too old to polish truth. "From husbands, brothers, sometimes from sons, sometimes just from a town that would rather call a woman troublesome than lift a hand to help her." He looked at Margaret with something that lived in the space between sorrow and respect. "When Dorothy got sick, some folks were glad for it. Said the place had become an embarrassment. Said it invited scandal. After she died, records changed. Boundaries shifted. People stopped talking. And 2 weeks ago," Cecil added, his voice dropping, "somebody came out here measuring the east side. Truck had a logo on the door. Ridgeway Development. They knew about this land before you did." Margaret felt the weight of that settle into her chest. "Why did you never tell anyone?" she asked. Cecil gave a smile that had no humor in it. "Tell whom? The county clerk who changed the maps, the sheriff whose father looked the other way. I am an old black man in a town that rewards silence, Mrs. Holloway. I told the only person who might listen." He paused, "And she just arrived." He tipped his cap toward her and disappeared into the dark as quietly as he had come, swallowed by it, the way truth gets swallowed in towns that prefer not to hear. For a long time, Margaret stood motionless in the kitchen, one hand resting on the hidden letters, the other hanging at her side. The property her family had laughed at was no random ruin. The missing records were no clerical accident. The emptied house, the concealed papers, the silence wrapped around this land, like a bandage over a wound no one wanted to treat, it had all been done with intention. At 76, after being pushed out of the life she had spent decades building for other people, Margaret Holloway stood in the first place that had ever asked nothing of her except that she see it clearly. Henry appeared in his doorway. "We should leave before it gets any darker." Margaret did not answer immediately. She pulled out a kitchen chair, sat down, and opened the leather notebook. It was not a diary in the ordinary sense. No sentimental reflections, no weather notes, no recipes. It was a record. Names, dates, initials when full names would have been too dangerous. Short entries in Dorothy Fenwick's firm, careful hand. December 4th. Woman arrived after dark with split lip and child asleep in her arms. Kept a lantern in the back room only. March 11th. Lanterns out. Sheriff passed twice. Stayed quiet until he left. June 2nd. Sent him north before dawn. Burn this page if anyone asks. Margaret pressed her fingers to her mouth. She had lived long enough to recognize what was written between these lines. Shame, fear, secrecy forced by survival. Women hidden because the world had made it plain that being found was more dangerous than disappearing. Henry came closer. You ought to rest. Margaret did not look up. I think my grandmother spent half her life making sure other women could rest. I can manage one sleepless night. She turned the page, and then the next. And outside, the wind moved through the dark trees in long, low breaths, and inside the old house creaked and settled around her. Not like a building coming apart, but like a place remembering what it had been built for. She was not leaving before morning. Part 2, Beneath the Floor. Margaret did not sleep. She had not expected to. What she had expected even less was the way the house changed after midnight. The way its silence shifted from emptiness into something closer to attention, as if the walls had spent decades listening to nothing and were now straining to hear what she would do next. Henry had made a nest for himself in the parlor corner, with 2 quilts found in the upstairs linen chest. He slept the way old men do in short shifts, interrupted by coughing and the creak of joints that had outlived their warranty. Margaret stayed at the kitchen table under the battery lantern, with her grandmother's letters spread before her, each one a window cut into a life she had never been told existed. By 2 in the morning, she had read 7 of them. Dorothy's handwriting did not soften over time. If anything, it grew more compressed, more urgent, as though the woman had understood that ink was cheap, but safety was not, and every word had to earn its place on the page. One letter described a county official who had visited the property twice in 1 week asking questions about occupancy and water rights. Another mentioned lumber delivered at night by a man Dorothy referred to only as MC, whose initials appeared in 4 separate entries across 3 years. A third letter written in a hand that shook slightly at the margins contained a single paragraph that Margaret read 3 times before she could breathe normally again. They've begun to call me difficult. I do not mind the word, I mind what it replaces. They cannot say dangerous because a woman sheltering other women is not dangerous to anyone except the men those women fled. So they say difficult, and they say eccentric, and they say she ought to be looked after. And by the time the language has finished doing its work, the woman standing in the way is no longer a person. She is a problem to be tidied. Margaret lowered the page. The lantern hissed softly. Outside, wind moved through the pine stand along the eastern boundary of the property, carrying the smell of frozen earth and old cedar, and something underneath both that might have been memory itself if memory had a scent. She understood now why the house had been stripped. Not by time, by intention. Someone had come through these rooms after Dorothy's death and removed what could be removed, erased what could be erased, and left behind only what seemed worthless to people who measured value exclusively in dollars. They had missed the sewing box. They had missed the panel in the pantry wall. They had missed the letters. They had missed everything that mattered. When gray light finally pressed through the kitchen window, Henry was already pulling on his coat. I need to go back to town, he said. Coffee, food, and a crowbar from the storage shed at my office. A crowbar. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had stayed up half the night thinking about floorboards. There are things in this house that are not where they appear to be. I would like to find out what is underneath them. Margaret nodded. I will be here. I know you will. He drove away in the pale morning, and Margaret was alone in the house for the first time. She moved through it, slowly room by room, seeing everything differently now. The low brass hook in the second bedroom was not decorative. It was functional, placed at the height where a frightened woman sitting on a cot might hang a coat or a bag she needed to grab quickly. The worn marks near the back stairs were not damage. They were the evidence of feet moving in the same path night after night, always toward the rear door, always in the direction of escape. The windows had been positioned so that someone standing inside could see the road without being visible from it. Nothing about the place was grand. Everything about it was purposeful. When Henry returned, Margaret was standing in the front bedroom, staring at the floor. "What is it?" he asked. She pointed near the iron bed frame. "The boards do not wear evenly here. Look at this section along the wall. The color is different, darker, as if the wood has been lifted and fitted back more than once." Henry set down the coffee and crouched beside her. He tapped the boards with the handle of the crowbar. The sound came back hollow. They looked at each other, and neither needed to speak. "Stand back," he said. The first pry only splintered paint. The second lifted the board enough to break the seal of decades. Dust rose in a sharp cloud. Henry worked carefully, easing up two boards, then a third. Beneath them lay not dirt or crawl space, but a square opening, framed in old timber, no wider than a narrow door laid flat. A ladder of crude wooden rungs dropped into darkness. Margaret felt her pulse in her throat. Not fear, anticipation of a kind she had not experienced since she was young enough to believe that the world still contained secrets worth finding. Henry lowered the lantern. The beam caught a small room below, no more than 6 feet by 8. Dry, intact, hidden beneath a house that everyone had written off as worthless. "I'm going first," Henry said. The ladder groaned but held. When he reached the bottom, his voice came up low and shaken in a way Margaret had never heard from him in all the years she had known him. "Mrs. Holloway, you need to see this." She descended more slowly, one hand on the rung, the other on the side rail. The air below smelled of cedar and old paper and something faintly chemical, perhaps the remnants of preservative applied to wood decades ago to keep moisture from destroying what was stored here. Her shoes touched packed earth. She lifted the lantern and turned. Shelves lined 2 walls built with the same careful craftsmanship as the hidden panel upstairs. On them sat document boxes, wrapped bundles, ledgers with cracked spines, and tin containers labeled in small, precise script. A folding cot leaned against the far wall. Beside it, a wash basin, 2 wool blankets, and a child's wooden horse with one wheel missing. Margaret stared at all of it in a silence so complete it felt sacred. This was not a storage space. This was not a cellar. This was a room built for human beings who had nowhere else to go, furnished with the bare minimum required to survive a night or a week, hidden beneath the floor of a house that the world above had been told was empty. "This was a shelter," Henry said. Margaret shook her head slowly. "This was survival made into a room." She stepped closer to the shelves. One box held deeds, tax maps, land surveys, and correspondence with county offices dating back to the 1940s. Another contained receipts for lumber, coal, medical supplies, canned food, and train tickets purchased under initials that matched no name in any public record Margaret had ever seen. In a tin case beneath the cot were photographs. Margaret lifted the first one with both hands, a woman standing stiffly beside the porch above them, her face wary but alive, one arm around a child who could not have been more than 4. The next photograph showed 2 women, neither young, both too thin, standing in what must have been the kitchen before it was stripped. The third showed a woman alone, gray at the temples, holding a bundled infant against her chest, with the fierceness of someone who had learned that softness could get you killed. Margaret turned one photograph over. On the back, in her grandmother's handwriting, were the words, "No woman is too old to be put away. No woman is too old to be saved." She pressed the photograph against her chest and closed her eyes. Henry had been sorting through the legal documents in silence. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Margaret. She opened her eyes. He held a folded survey map and a notarized statement clipped to it. The original property lines, he said. This land used to extend another 12 acres east, including the spring house in the lower field. 12 acres. He nodded, and the grimness in his face was not the kind that comes from bad news, but from confirmed suspicion. According to this, those 12 acres were transferred after your grandmother's death under circumstances that do not survive even basic scrutiny. Transferred by whom? Henry checked the signature line on the notarized statement. Then he went still, the way a man goes still when he recognizes a name he did not want to find. The witness on the transfer, he said, speaking each word as if placing it on a scale, was Vernon Holloway. The name landed in the hidden room beneath the floor like a stone dropped into still water. Vernon Holloway, her late husband Robert's uncle, a man who had spent his life attending church suppers, chairing the Rotary auction, shaking hands with the particular warmth of someone who understood that friendliness was the cheapest form of camouflage available to a dishonest man. Margaret did not blink. She stood in that underground room holding photographs of rescued women in one hand, while the architecture of betrayal assembled itself in the other. Henry carried 3 document boxes up from the hidden room and spread their contents across the kitchen table. Morning light pressed through the dirty windows, turning dust motes to silver, and Margaret stood at the sink with both hands braced against the counter, looking not at the papers, but at the land beyond the glass. When she turned, her face was composed in the way that only deeply wounded people know how to be. It was not calm, it was controlled. There is a difference, and anyone who has been hurt badly enough to learn it never forgets. "Show me," she said. Henry laid out the original survey map beside the later county version he had brought from town. Side by side, the fraud was almost insulting in its simplicity. The original track stretched east toward the spring house and lower field. The later version simply cut that portion away and folded it into the neighboring parcel, as if 12 acres could be subtracted from a woman's life, the same way you might erase a pencil mark provided the woman was dead and no one was paying attention. "They shrank it," Margaret said. "While she was dying," Henry confirmed. "The filing date is 6 weeks after her death, but the witness signatures could have been prepared earlier." He placed a notarized statement on the table between them. The witness line bore the name she had already heard, Vernon Holloway. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat. "I served that man lemon pie for 15 years, she said quietly. "He used to pat my hand at holiday dinners and call me a sensible girl." Henry began to say he was sorry, then stopped himself. Margaret noticed. "Good," she said. "You are going to stop saying that. Sorry is what people say when the truth is ugly, but they do not intend to do anything with it." A brief silence passed. Then Henry gave one small nod. "All right, then I will say this instead. I think we can prove the transfer was improper. Not criminally, not this late, not with most of the people involved dead, but civilly. We can challenge the title to the lost acreage. At the very least, we can expose the manipulation." He opened the leather notebook to a page he had marked and turned it toward her. Dorothy's handwriting, firm and severe. "They do not hate the land, they hate what the land permits. A woman was somewhere to go." Margaret read it twice, then as she reached for another paper folded into the back of the notebook. A letter never sent. Addressed not to an attorney or a county office, but to Margaret in Dorothy's hand. The sight of her own name written by a woman who had been dead for more than 60 years made her throat close. She unfolded it carefully. "If this reaches you, then time has done what family may not. I leave this not to the strongest, but to the one most likely to understand what it costs a woman to remain gentle in a house that benefits from her silence." Henry did not move. Margaret continued reading. They will tell you land is land, that money is money, that at your age comfort is enough. They will be wrong. A woman may survive without luxury, but she cannot survive whole while being made to feel she has no rightful place left in the world. She lowered the page and pressed her fingertips against her lips. The letter was not a message from the past. It was a mirror held up to the present by someone who had seen the future clearly enough to prepare for it. Beneath the letter were two final documents. The first was a draft trust outline in Dorothy's name, proposing that the property be preserved as a refuge for women cast out widowed, endangered, or otherwise made inconvenient to the households that had used them. The second was a handwritten affidavit from a local doctor confirming he had treated injuries on women delivered to the property at night discreetly at Dorothy Fenwick's request. Henry exhaled. She was not just leaving you land. She was leaving you a purpose. Margaret looked at the trust draft, then at the doctor's affidavit, then at the stack of letters and photographs that had survived decades of burial because one woman had been stubborn enough to hide them where no one thought to look. Everyone will tell me to sell, she said. Yes. They will say I am too old to fight this. Yes. She lifted her eyes to his. They were no longer tired in the same way. The grief was still there. So was the humiliation. But something else had joined them, something with vertebrae. Then they should have thought of that, Margaret said, folding her grandmother's letter with immense care before they handed a forgotten woman the truth. By the third day, the silence around Blackstone Ridge was gone. Henry filed a petition for title review with the county recorder's office, requested preservation status for the recovered documents, and made two quiet phone calls to people he trusted. By noon, someone had seen his car at the county office. By evening, someone had noticed lights burning at the old Fenwick property. By the following morning, Millbrook had done what Millbrook always did. It turned a buried truth into public entertainment before anyone involved was ready for it. Ray Fulton arrived at the property without warning on a Tuesday morning, driving a county truck with a clipboard on the passenger seat and a camera hanging from his neck. He was 50, clean-shaven, with the compact build and measured movements of a man who understood that government work required not competence but the appearance of it. He was already walking the eastern boundary of the property when Margaret saw him from the kitchen window. The eastern boundary, not the house, not the structure he had supposedly come to evaluate. The disputed 12 acres that Henry had just filed papers to reclaim. Margaret stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" Fulton turned with a professional smile already in place. "Mrs. Holloway, Ray Fulton County Assessor's Office. I am here to conduct a structural evaluation of the residence. Standard procedure when a property changes hands. Standard procedure does not usually begin with measuring land a quarter mile from the building in question." The smile held, but something behind it recalculated. "I was just getting the lay of the property." Margaret came down the steps slowly, and each step carried the deliberate weight of a woman who had learned that rushing made you look uncertain. You arrived without an appointment, without written notice, without so much as a phone call. In my experience, men who skip all three courtesies are rarely here to help. Henry's Buick appeared on the gravel road before Fulton could respond. Henry parked, got out, and approached with the unhurried pace of a man who had been expecting exactly this. "Mr. Fulton," Henry said, "do you have a formal inspection order?" Fulton hesitated one beat too long. "I can have one by end of week." "Then you can come back at end of week with the order and with prior notice to my client." Fulton looked from Henry to Margaret into the house behind her, and something passed across his face that was not anger but measurement. He was calculating what they knew. Margaret recognized the look. She had seen it on the faces of men at church auctions who bid casually on items they wanted, desperately hoping no one would notice the desire beneath the indifference. He left without argument, but he did not apologize, and he did not say goodbye. 20 minutes later, Cecil Marsh came up the drive carrying a paper bag of sweet rolls his wife had baked. He set them on the porch rail and looked toward the road where Fulton's truck had disappeared. That man's truck was parked at the Ridgeway Development office in Cooperton last Thursday, Cecil said. I saw it when I went for livestock feed. Same truck, same plates. Henry and Margaret looked at each other. The county assessor sent to evaluate the property for demolition was meeting privately with the developer who wanted to buy the land it sat on. The collaboration was not even subtle. It was the kind of arrangement that worked only because the people involved believed no one was watching. They had not counted on Cecil Marsh buying feed on a Thursday. The rest of that morning passed in preparation. Henry organized the documents from the hidden room into categories legal, personal, evidentiary. Margaret cleaned the front room window until light could reach the table where they worked. Cecil repaired a section of porch railing that had been leaning dangerously since before any of them had arrived. Nobody discussed what they were preparing for. They all knew. James's truck appeared on the gravel just after 1 o'clock. Brenda sat beside him in a camel-colored coat that had no business being anywhere near mud. They climbed out with the alert, careful posture of people approaching a situation they intended to control. Mom, James said, raising one hand. Margaret did not wave back. You found the road. Brenda forced a smile. We came because we were worried. Margaret looked at the truck, then at Brenda's clean boots, then at her face. You drove 30 minutes over ice for worry. James stepped closer. Can we not do this out here? No, Margaret said. Out here is exactly where you wanted me. James tried again. We heard there may be some dispute over the land, legal complications. We thought you should not be handling something like that alone. Henry spoke from the doorway behind Margaret. She is not. Brenda's eyes flicked to him. No offense, Henry, but this is family. Margaret answered before he could. Family was what I was told I no longer had when I was given until noon. Brenda inhaled sharply. That is not what happened. And then Brenda said something no one in that driveway expected, least of all herself. It came out louder than she intended, pushed by a pressure that had been building long before this morning, and once it was in the air, she could not pull it back. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoy being the villain in this story? We are drowning, Margaret. The insurance company denied my claim. James took a pay cut in October. I have been splitting my own medication for 3 months because we cannot afford the full prescription and yours at the same time. The words landed on the frozen ground between them and stayed there, visible, ugly, and impossible to unsee. For the first time, Margaret looked at Brenda not with anger, but with something more difficult. Recognition. She had seen those medical envelopes on the kitchen table. She had noticed the grip on the door frame. She had filed it away without comment, and now the file was open. Then you know, Margaret said quietly, exactly what it feels like to be reduced to a problem someone else wants solved cheaply. Brenda opened her mouth and closed it again. James stared at the ground. Before anyone could recover, a dark sedan appeared behind James's truck. Clean, expensive. Out stepped a man in a navy overcoat with polished shoes wholly unsuited to gravel. He carried a leather folder and the expression of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. Mrs. Holloway, he said, approaching with a practiced smile. My name is Garrett Lynch. I represent Ridgeway Development. We have recently become aware that your parcel may sit adjacent to land of emerging commercial interest. I would be happy to discuss a very generous cash offer. Margaret looked from the developer to her son and daughter-in-law. You only arrived at the exact same time, she said. James flushed. Mom, listen. She held up one hand and he stopped. Then she descended the remaining porch steps until she stood in the frozen grass facing all three of them. My grandmother hid women here, she said, fed them, protected them. She left records proving this land was stripped, silenced, and reduced by people who preferred inconvenient women to disappear. 3 days ago, none of you cared whether I had heat. Today you have arrived with concern opinions and purchase offers. She turned to James. You came back for the land before you came back for your mother. The sentence hung between them with the weight of something that could not be taken back and should not be. Lynch opened his folder. Mrs. Holloway's sentiment is understandable, but she looked at him and whatever he saw in her face stopped the sentence before it could finish. That evening, after James and Brenda had driven away in silence, and Lynch had retreated to whatever office produced men like him, Pastor Baines came to Blackstone Ridge for the second time. He did not come at James's request. He came because the story had reached the congregation, and Baines was the kind of man who believed that spiritual authority meant arriving at every crisis, whether invited or not. He knocked on the kitchen door gently, as if gentleness could disguise the presumption underneath it. Margaret let him in. She poured tea. She let him sit. Baines spoke carefully. I have heard about your situation, Margaret, about the documents and the claims you are making. I want you to know that I understand the emotional pull of a place like this, but I also want to be honest with you. He folded his hands on the table. Sometimes our attachments to things keep us from accepting the peace God has prepared for us. Margaret set her teacup down. Without a word, she opened the leather notebook to the pages she had marked and turned it toward him. Baines read. His lips moved slightly as his eyes traveled down Dorothy's entries. Woman arrived after dark, kept lantern out, sheriff passed, sent north before dawn. He turned the page, then another. The silence in the kitchen grew heavier with each line he absorbed. Pastor Margaret said, you are asking me to let go of a place that held women your church did not. Baines looked up from the notebook. His face had lost its composure. Not dramatically, not with the visible collapse of a man proven wrong, but with the slower, more painful erosion of a man realizing that the ground he had been standing on was not as solid as he had preached. He stood. He picked up his hat. I need to think about what you have shown me, he said, and he left without offering a single verse of scripture, which from Loy Baines was as close to silence as a man of his profession could get. Nora Shipley arrived the following afternoon. She came in a car that was older than Margaret's suitcase, parked it beside the fence, and sat behind the wheel for a full 2 minutes before getting out, as if she needed that long to persuade herself that what she had driven 30 miles to do was not a mistake. She was in her 60s, thin, with an upright posture that suggested not confidence, but the refusal to bend for anyone who had not earned it. She carried a folder clutched against her chest so tightly it might have been holding her together. My name is Nora Shipley, she said, standing at the foot of the porch steps. I heard about this place on the local radio 2 days ago. I have something that belongs here. Margaret came down to meet her. Nora opened the folder. Inside was a photograph. A young woman on the porch of this very house, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, a wool blanket draped around her shoulders. The woman's face was turned slightly away from the camera, not in shame, but in the manner of someone who had learned that being seen too clearly was a form of danger. That is my mother, Nora said. In 1958, she was 23 years old. Her husband had broken 2 of her ribs and told the sheriff she was hysterical. Dorothy Fenwick hid her here for 8 days. Nora's voice broke exactly once on the word 8, as if that number carried the specific weight of every night her mother had spent in a room beneath a floor, waiting to find out whether she would live. If that woman had not opened the door, Nora said, neither of us would have survived long enough for me to be standing here. Margaret took the photograph. She held it with both hands, and for the first time since the morning she had been told to leave her own home, she cried, not for herself, for the woman in the photograph who had needed a stranger's courage more than her own family's love, for Dorothy who had given that courage night after night in a house the world tried to erase. For every name in the notebook that had been reduced to an initial because a full identity was too dangerous to write down. Henry stood in the doorway and let her cry without interruption because he understood that some grief is not a wound but a door opening. That night, after Nora had gone and Cecil had brought firewood, and Henry had begun drafting the petition he would present to the town council, a knock came at the door so soft Margaret almost missed it. Denise Holloway stood on the porch, 24 years old, Margaret's granddaughter, James's daughter. She wore a backpack over one shoulder and held a laptop under her arm, and her face carried the particular expression of a young woman who has just discovered that the people she trusted have been lying to her. "Dad told me you moved to a facility," Denise said. "Mom said you chose to go. I found the truth on the local newspaper's website 2 hours ago, and I drove here from the city without stopping." Margaret looked at her granddaughter. Of everyone in the family, Denise was the only one who had come, not because of the land, not because of the money, not because of the legal dispute, but because she was angry about the lie. "Come inside," Margaret said. Denise spent the next 3 hours photographing every document from the hidden room. She was methodical in the way her generation understood instinctively converting fragile paper into permanent digital files, creating backups, organizing folders on her laptop with labels and dates. "You need copies," she said. "If someone tries to make the originals disappear, the copies survive." Margaret watched her work and felt something she had not felt in months. Gratitude that did not require her to be small in order to receive it. Near midnight, Denise reached the last photograph in the tin case. She turned it over to photograph the back, and then she stopped. "Grandma," Margaret came to her side. On the back of the photograph in Dorothy's handwriting was a name, Marion Fulton, 1961. Denise looked up. "Fulton, is that not the name of the county assessor, the one who came here?" Margaret took the photograph from her granddaughter's hands and held it under the lantern light. A woman in her 20s standing beside the porch, one hand on the railing, the other pressed flat against her stomach in the way women do when they are protecting something growing inside them. Marion Fulton, sheltered by Dorothy Fenwick in 1961, grandmother of the man the county had sent to condemn this house. Ray Fulton was trying to demolish the place that had saved his own grandmother's life. Whether he knew it or not was a question that would have to wait until morning. But the photograph would not wait. It sat on the table between Margaret and Denise like a lit fuse in a room full of paper. Margaret looked at the ceiling. Somewhere above them, the old house settled in the cold, and for the first time its creaking sounded less like fatigue and more like a woman clearing her throat before she speaks. Tomorrow was the town council hearing. Margaret had evidence, witnesses, allies, and a photograph that could undo the one man standing between her and the truth. She also had a son who wanted her to sell a daughter-in-law who was drowning in her own silence, a developer with lawyers and money and a body that was 76 years old and running on tea and stubbornness. She picked up the photograph of Marion Fulton and placed it carefully in the folder Henry would carry to the hearing. Then she turned off the lantern and sat in the dark listening to the house breathe around her, and she did not pray because she had never been the praying kind. But she made a promise to the woman who had built this room beneath the floor, the woman who had hidden testimony where no one thought to look, the woman whose name the world had tried to subtract from its records, the way you erase a line from a map. She promised she would not be erased either. Part 3. Open the door again. The town council chamber above the Millbrook municipal offices had not been renovated since 1984, and it showed. Varnished benches the color of dark honey lined both sides of the aisle. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that made everyone sitting beneath them look slightly unwell. A row of tall windows along the east wall had been painted shut so many times that the frames had fused to the sills, sealing in decades of recycled air and the faint institutional smell of floor wax and old decisions. Margaret had been in this room before, twice for zoning complaints, once for a school levy vote that failed by 11 ballots, once during a bitter January for a public hearing about whether to close the town library 2 afternoons a week to save $400 a month. She had spoken at that hearing. She had been polite. The library hours were cut anyway. This time was different. This time every seat was occupied. Farmers in clean jackets sat beside shop owners. Two reporters from the county paper shared a bench near the back. The high school art teacher had brought 3 students who had heard the story and wanted to see what happened next. The room had the charged, expectant atmosphere of a place where something was about to be settled that had waited too long for settling. Margaret wore her navy wool coat, the one she had saved for funerals and serious Sundays. She had pressed it the night before with an iron found in the house, heating it on the propane stove Cecil had connected that morning. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly. Her shoes were old but polished. She looked exactly like what small towns have always underestimated and what they have always regretted underestimating. An elderly woman who understood the cost of being dismissed and had finally exhausted her willingness to tolerate it. Henry stood beside her at the front table, a legal pad in one hand, and Dorothy Fenwick's recovered documents arranged in a banker's box at his feet. Across the aisle sat Garrett Lynch from Ridgeway Development, composed in a charcoal suit, his leather folder centered on the table in front of him, with the precision of a man who believed presentation was half of persuasion. James sat 2 rows behind Lynch, Brenda beside him. Both wore the strained, careful faces of people who wanted to appear neutral while privately hoping someone else would do whatever needed doing. Near the rear wall, Cecil Marsh had taken a seat with his cap in his lap and his back bent forward, but his eyes were sharp and moving. Beside him sat Nora Shipley, upright, her folder pressed against her chest. And 3 seats over, Denise Holloway sat with her laptop open and a USB drive resting on her knee. Councilwoman Sandra Pruitt called the session to order. She was 58, square-shouldered, with reading glasses she wore in a chain and a voice that carried without rising. She had served on the council for 12 years, long enough to know when a room was watching her and not the agenda. This session concerns a petition for title review and historical protection regarding the Fenwick parcel at Blackstone Ridge, she said. Mr. Caldwell, you may begin. Henry rose. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He spoke the way he had practiced law for 60 years, with the slow, factual cadence of a man who trusted evidence more than performance. He laid out the altered survey maps. He presented the late filed transfer document bearing Vernon Holloway's signature. He described the hidden room beneath the floor, the letters, the photographs, the trust draft Dorothy Fenwick had prepared before her death. He explained that the missing 12 acres had not vanished through neglect or clerical error, but through deliberate administrative manipulation carried out while Dorothy was dying and completed 6 weeks after her burial. He placed the doctor's affidavit on the table. He read one sentence from it aloud and then let the room absorb what that sentence meant. A murmur moved through the benches, not shock exactly, but the sound of people rearranging what they thought they knew. Then Lynch stood. He buttoned his jacket and addressed the council with the smooth, unhurried delivery of a man who had done this in rooms far larger than this one and won. With respect, he said, we are discussing old papers, emotional interpretations, and uses of property that were never formally registered with any agency. Ridgeway Development has no position on family sentiment. But commercial planning in the Blackstone corridor affects jobs, roads, and the county tax base. It would be irresponsible to unleash unverified nostalgia to obstruct economic progress. Henry replied without standing. A notarized affidavit is not nostalgia. Neither is a forged boundary adjustment. Lynch spread his hands. Forged is a serious word. So is buried, Margaret said from her chair. The room turned toward her. Ray Fulton was called next. He approached the front table carrying a manila folder and the composed expression of a man who believed his role in the proceedings was minor and technical. He presented what he called an independent structural assessment of the Fenwick residence, concluding that the house was unsafe for habitation and recommending demolition. This evaluation, Fulton said, was conducted according to standard county protocols. The foundation shows significant settling. The roof structure is compromised. Portions of the flooring are unstable. In my professional judgment, the building represents a liability. He sat down. A few council members made notes. Prewitt adjusted her glasses. Then Denise stood. She did not ask permission. She simply rose from her seat in the back row, walked to the front of the chamber carrying her laptop, and connected it to the projector that hung from the ceiling above the council's table. The projector had not been used in months, and it took a few seconds to warm up, and during those seconds, the room was perfectly quiet. The image appeared on the pull-down screen behind the council. A photograph. A young woman standing on the porch of the Fenwick House in 1961. One hand on the railing, the other pressed against her stomach. Beneath the image in Dorothy Fenwick's handwriting, digitally enhanced for clarity, was the name Marion Fulton. Denise turned to face Fulton. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the controlled precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment on the drive from the city and intended to deliver every word exactly as planned. Mr. Fulton, the woman in this photograph shares your surname. She was sheltered at this property in 1961, and her name appears in Dorothy Fenwick's records as a woman who was given refuge here. Before this council accepts your structural assessment as objective, I would like to ask whether Marion Fulton was your grandmother. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of 40 people holding their breath at the same time, each one of them watching Ray Fulton's face for the answer his mouth had not yet given. Fulton's color changed, not dramatically, a slow drain of pigment from the cheeks, the forehead, the skin around his jaw, as if his body were trying to retreat from the room, while the rest of him remained seated. He did not deny it. He could not. The resemblance between the woman in the photograph and the man at the table was subtle but unmistakable. Once you knew where to look, the same wide-set jaw, the same brow line, the same slightly downturned corners of the mouth. Councilwoman Prewitt removed her glasses. Mr. Fulton, you are excused from these proceedings. Your assessment will be stricken from the record pending an independent review of the property by a party with no prior connection to either the parcel or Ridgeway development. Fulton gathered his folder and stood. He moved toward the aisle with the mechanical gait of a man whose legs were following instructions his mind had not finished writing. As he passed Margaret's table, he paused. He did not look at the council or the audience. He looked only at her. My grandmother never talked about this place, he said quietly enough that only the front row heard. She was ashamed of it. Margaret met his eyes. She was ashamed of needing it. That is not the same thing. Something moved across Fulton's face. It was not agreement. It was something prior to agreement, the fracture that has to occur before understanding can enter. He walked out of the chamber without turning back. Prewitt looked at Henry. Is there anything further from the petitioner? Henry nodded toward Margaret. Mrs. Holloway would like to address the council. Margaret stood. She placed one hand on the back of her chair. She had imagined that anger, when it finally had an audience, would feel like heat. Instead, it felt like clarity. Every unnecessary word fell away. What remained was the truth, and the truth did not need decoration. I am 76 years old, she said. That seems to make people speak around me as if I am not in the room. So let me save this counsel some time. I know what this chamber sees. An old woman standing between a town and progress. A family disagreement in a legal costume. A patch of damaged land that might be more profitable flat than standing. She paused, not for effect, because the next sentence required her to look at her son, and she wanted to be looking at him when she said it. 4 days ago, I was told to leave my home before noon. I was too old to manage stairs, too expensive to accommodate, too inconvenient to keep. But the moment there was a whisper of value in this land, I became worth visiting again. James lowered his head. Brenda's hands tightened in her lap. Margaret turned back to the council. This is not about whether the parcel has commercial potential. It does. This is not about whether the county records were altered. They were. This is about something older and uglier than either. Some people are perfectly comfortable with property having value. They are far less comfortable with women, especially older women, having a place that no one can take from them. From the back of the room, Nora Shipley rose. Her voice shook once on the first word and then steadied. My name is Nora Shipley. My mother was brought to that house in 1958. She was 23 years old and pregnant. Her husband had broken her ribs and told the authorities she was delusional. Dorothy Fenwick took her in for 8 days. My mother told me that if that woman had not opened her door, neither of us would be alive. She held up the photograph. The room saw it. The room understood it. Cecil Marsh stood next, cap in hand. My father hauled wood to that property every winter. Never took a cent for it. He said Dorothy Fenwick was doing the work the county was too afraid to do, and the church was too proud to admit needed doing. From the center of the room, a man rose that no one expected. Pastor Lloyd Baines stood, slowly adjusted his coat, and addressed the council with none of the polished certainty Margaret had heard in his voice at the lawyer's office or at her kitchen table. I came here tonight intending to speak for prudence, he said. I was shown documents earlier this week that I have not been able to put down since. I will not tell this council what to do with the land. That is not my place. But I will say this. A church that calls itself a sanctuary should recognize one when it is standing right next door. The room was still. Prewitt looked at the documents spread across the front table, then at Ruth, then at Cecil, then at Baines, and finally at Margaret. This council will suspend all development consideration affecting the disputed boundary effective immediately pending a full title review. We will also initiate an emergency historical assessment of the Fenwick property through the State Preservation Office. Brenda inhaled sharply. James closed his eyes. Lynch closed his folder and did not reopen it. Henry sat down slowly with the expression of a man who had spent 60 years pushing paper through courtrooms and county offices and had never once seen truth find its footing this fast. But then he had never seen anyone stop apologizing for it before. As the chamber began to empty, Lynch approached Margaret one last time. His voice dropped to a register meant for privacy. Mrs. Holloway, this could still become a very profitable transaction. Margaret looked at him without blinking. Yes, she said, and that is precisely why I have to decide what it is worth not to sell. The offer from Ridgeway arrived the following morning on cream-colored paper folded inside a leather portfolio that Henry carried out to Blackstone Ridge, with the cautious expression of a man transporting something volatile. Margaret read it on the back porch in the early light. The numbers were large enough to rewrite the final chapter of any ordinary life. A private suite in a premier senior residence. Medical care without limits or worry. A car service. Warm winters. The kind of comfort that people like Brenda called dignity when what they meant was compliance dressed in clean sheets. Attached was a note suggesting that given her age, a swift and peaceful resolution would be in her best interest. Margaret handed the papers back. Men always offer comfort when what they really want is for surrender to look voluntary. Henry did not argue the point. He sat beside her and said with the directness she had come to rely on, "You are 76. This will be a hard fight for someone half your age. Restoring the house, defending the title, turning any of it into something more than a legal victory on paper. No one would blame you for choosing peace." Margaret looked at him. Henry, peace and being put away are not the same thing. A week after the hearing, Henry called with his voice pulled tight. Ridgway had hired a state-level attorney to file a challenge with the County Planning Commission, bypassing the Millbrook Town Council entirely. Their argument was technical and not without merit. The council lacked jurisdiction to freeze development on adjacent private land based solely on a historical petition that had not yet been formally adjudicated. "They are not attacking your property anymore," Henry said. "They are attacking the decision to protect it." Margaret sat on the porch and looked at the eastern field, the 12 acres the council had ordered reviewed, but had not yet formally restored. If Ridgway won at the county level, the freeze would dissolve. The disputed land could be developed before the title review was complete. Everything Dorothy had hidden, everything Margaret had uncovered, could be rendered legally irrelevant by a procedural ruling in an office 60 miles away. Margaret did not sit with this long. She had spent enough of her life waiting for other people to act. "File for state historical designation," she told Henry. "Not just county, state." Nora contacted a women's heritage preservation organization in Richmond. They responded within 48 hours with a letter of support and an offer to send a field historian to examine the property. Denise wrote an account of Fenwick House and posted it online. It was not picked up by any major outlet, but it was shared by 3 organizations that advocated for elderly women's housing rights. And within a week, the story had traveled far enough that 2 state legislators' offices made inquiries to the county about the status of the preservation petition. Cecil brought the last piece. He had spent 3 days on the phone and driving back roads, and he arrived at Blackstone Ridge on a Thursday evening with a name and an address written on a gas station receipt. "The doctor who wrote that affidavit," Cecil said. "His daughter is alive. She is 80 years old, lives outside Richmond, and she told me she can verify her father's handwriting and confirm he spoke to her about treating women at this property. She is willing to sign a statement." Henry took the receipt and held it as if it were made of glass. "That is the last piece I need for the state petition." 6 weeks later, the Commonwealth of Virginia granted emergency historical designation to the Fenwick property at Blackstone Ridge. Ridgway Development's county-level challenge became moot. The disputed 12 acres were formally restored to the trust. The developer withdrew without public comment and redirected operations to a parcel 40 miles south where the soil held no secrets, and no one's grandmother had built a room beneath the floor. James came to the property on the afternoon of the decision. His truck came up the drive slower than it ever had before, as if the vehicle itself understood that what waited at the end of the road required something more than arrival. He found Margaret in the front room sorting through the last of Dorothy's papers at a table set beneath the window she had cleaned with her own hands on the second day. Without, the grime light reached into corners of the room that had not seen sun in decades. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "I did not come to argue," he said. "No," Margaret said without looking up. "You came because the decision is final and there is nothing left to argue about." He deserved that. He accepted it without flinching, which was more than he had managed at any previous visit. "Denise sent me copies of the documents," he said. "I read them, all of them, the notebook, the letters, the photographs." He paused. "I did not know what this place was." Margaret set down the paper she was holding. "You did not ask." "No, I did not." He came into the room and sat across from her, and for a moment he looked younger. Not better, not wiser, just smaller the way a man looks when he has finally stopped performing the version of himself that other people made comfortable and is sitting with what remains. I keep replaying that morning, he said. You on the porch, me saying noon. I do not know how I became a man who could say that to his mother. Margaret looked at him by saying yes to small, selfish things until they became your character. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. I am sorry. She studied his face for a long time. This apology was different from the others. It was not strategic. It was not timed to coincide with an offer or a request. It was just a man sitting across from his mother in a room full of evidence that the world had been harder on women than he had ever bothered to notice, and the weight of that evidence had finally become heavier than his comfort. You can be sorry, Margaret said, but sorry is not repair. I know. If you want to repair something, start there. She nodded toward the porch where Cecil was stacking lumber for the new garden fence. Carry wood, fix what is broken, drive women to their appointments when the time comes. Learn to be useful without needing to own what you help. James looked at the porch at Cecil working in the cold at the house that had survived everything his family and the county and Ridgeway and time itself had thrown at it. Would you ever forgive me? He asked. Margaret rested one hand on the table beside her grandmother's letters. Her knuckles were thin. Her wrist was narrow. Age had not reversed any of its claims on her body, but there was something in her how that age could not touch a settledness that had nothing to do with surrender and everything to do with a woman who had finally stopped asking permission to take up space. I have already decided not to live the rest of my life as a hostage to bitterness, she said. That is the closest thing you will get today. He nodded. Tears moved down his face without sound. And for the first time in many years, James Holloway accepted an answer from his mother without trying to negotiate a better one. That evening, Brenda called. The conversation was short. Brenda did not apologize because Brenda was not built for apologies and Margaret had stopped expecting them. What she said was this: Denise showed me the photographs. I do not pretend to understand what you are building out there. But I need you to know that what I did was not cruelty on purpose. It was fear. I was terrified of what would happen to us if one more thing went wrong, and removing you felt like removing a variable I could control. Margaret listened to the silence on the line after Brenda finished. It was the silence of a woman who had said something true for the first time in months and did not know what came after truth when you are not accustomed to telling it. Fear and cruelty look the same from the outside, Brenda, Margaret said, but I hear you. It was not forgiveness. It was not reunion. It was a crack in a wall that had been built by two women who had both been afraid and had each chosen the worst possible way to handle it. Whether the crack would widen into a door or seal shut again was a question for a later season. By the time spring reached Blackstone Ridge, the house had stopped looking like something waiting to collapse. The porch was reinforced with lumber Cecil had milled himself. The clapboards were repaired where they could be and replaced where they had rotted through. New glass filled the front windows, catching the morning sun and sending it into rooms that had spent decades in the dark. Nora sewed curtains from cotton panels her mother had stored in a cedar chest for 60 years without ever explaining why. The fabric was faded but clean, and when the curtains hung in the front windows, they gave the house something it had not possessed since Dorothy Fenwick's death: the appearance of being waited in. Henry handled the trust filings with the methodical satisfaction of a man who had finally found paperwork worth losing sleep over. Denise built a website. She contacted 3 women's organizations and 2 legal aid clinics. She set up a phone number that forwarded to Margaret's kitchen, where a second-hand telephone now sat on the counter beside a jar of wildflowers Cecil's wife had brought. The sign went up on a Saturday morning. modest, wooden, hand-painted by the high school art teacher after her students heard the story and refused to let Ridgeway Development have the last word. It read Fenwick House, and underneath in smaller letters, a home for women who still deserve one. Ray Fulton came back once more. On a Tuesday afternoon in late March, Margaret looked out the kitchen window and saw him standing at the fence alone without his clipboard or his county truck or any of the professional armor he had worn the last time she saw him. He stood there for a long time before she walked out to meet him. "I looked into it," he said. "Marion Fulton was my grandmother. She died when I was 14. She never told me. She never told anyone." Margaret waited. "I did not come to apologize for the assessment," he said. "I came because I spent 2 weeks reading everything your granddaughter put online, and I realized that I nearly destroyed the only place that kept my family's bloodline from ending before I was born." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask to be part of what came next. He simply stood at the fence with the knowledge of what he had almost done and let it sit on him with its full weight. "Now you know," Margaret said. "That is the beginning, not the end." He nodded once and left. Helen Pratt was the first. She arrived on an April afternoon carrying 2 grocery bags and a pharmacy sack. She was 71, recently widowed, temporarily staying with a nephew whose wife had begun referring to her as the situation in the guest room, while Helen sat 3 feet away. Margaret opened the front door before Helen could knock. "You are right on time," she said. Helen blinked, still standing on the porch with the posture of a woman bracing to be told she had the wrong address. "I may only need to stay a few days." "You may stay long enough to stop apologizing before you sit down." Something in Helen's face collapsed and reassembled, at the same time the way a held breath releases and becomes the first real breath a person has taken in weeks. By early summer, there were 4. Helen took the downstairs room near the kitchen because she said she slept better hearing someone moving around before dawn. Edith Stokes arrived next, a retired bookkeeper with arthritic hands and nowhere to go after her rent tripled overnight. She organized the pantry with a precision that frightened everyone and labeled every container in the refrigerator with the date and the name of whoever had put it there. Constance Webb, 78, came with 1 suitcase and a cough that would not quit, and she stayed because Margaret never once used the word charity. Pearl Dunning had the smallest upstairs room. She had spent years cycling through motels after her son sold the trailer she lived in and called it a favor. Each woman arrived carrying a different story. All of them arrived carrying the same wound, which was not poverty or illness or age itself, but the experience of having lived long enough and worked hard enough and loved enough people and buried enough people to earn the right to rest, and instead being made to feel that their continued existence was an inconvenience someone else had to manage. Fenwick House did not cure that wound. It answered it. With a room, with a door that locked from the inside, with meals no one had to earn by being pleasant or grateful or quiet. With rules Margaret called courtesies, no one would be spoken over at the dinner table. No one would be shamed for needing to sleep through the afternoon. No one's medication would be moved without permission. No one would have to apologize for being alive in order to eat supper. Some evenings, the women sat on the porch and watched the light turn gold over the lower field that Henry had fought to reclaim. Some evenings, Nora read from the newspaper while Edith corrected the grammar under her breath. Some evenings were quiet enough to hear the screen door swing gently open and shut as women moved through the house, the way people move through a place where they are allowed to exist without justification. Denise stayed. She did not return to the city. She set up an office in the small room off the kitchen where Dorothy had once kept preserves, and from that room she managed the correspondence, the donations, the legal documents, and the growing list of women who had heard about Fenwick House from a friend or a social worker or a newspaper article and wanted to know if there might be room for one more. There was always room for one more. That was the rule Margaret never wrote down and never had to. On the first anniversary of the morning, she had been told to leave her home before noon. Margaret placed a photograph above the parlor mantel. It was a small portrait, not grand at all. Dorothy Fenwick's face was plain and intelligent and unsmiling. It was the face of a woman who had understood two things with perfect clarity: that the world discarded women with an ease that should have alarmed everyone, and that one safe piece of property properly loved could stand against more cruelty than anyone would have guessed. That evening, the dining table was full. Soup steamed in mismatched bowls. Bread passed from hand to hand without anyone needing to ask. Helen laughed at something Cecil said and nearly knocked over her tea. Constance was arguing with Edith about whether the upstairs hall needed longer curtains or simply better rods, and neither of them was willing to concede. Pearl hummed while she set a pie on the table, and the humming was soft and tuneless and perfect because it was the sound of a woman who had stopped expecting to be told to keep quiet. Henry sat at the far end with a glass of water and the expression of a man who had accidentally become part of a family and wisely decided not to fight it. Margaret looked around the room. She looked at the faces lit by the overhead lamp that Denise had installed when the electrical work was finished. She looked at the hands reaching for bread and the mouths open with conversation, and the shoulders that no longer carried the particular hunch of women who had spent years making themselves small enough to be tolerated. She understood then, with a fullness that pressed against the inside of her chest, what her grandmother had truly left her. Not land, not documents, not a legal victory, not even justice, though some had come. What Dorothy Fenwick had left Margaret Holloway was a continuation, a charge, a responsibility passed from one woman the world tried to erase to another woman the world tried to discard. The chain had not broken. It had simply gone underground for 60 years, hidden beneath floorboards and inside pantry walls, waiting for someone stubborn enough to pull it back into the light. James came by on Sundays now. He brought lumber and mason jars and once a set of garden tools he had driven 2 towns over to find because the local hardware store did not carry the brand his mother preferred. He did not ask to be thanked. He did not ask to be forgiven again. He carried and fixed and drove and listened, and slowly, without announcement or ceremony, he began to learn something his mother had always known, and he had spent 53 years refusing to understand: that usefulness is not ownership, and love is not a transaction, and the measure of a man is not what he provides, but what he protects when there is nothing in it for him. The family that had sent Margaret to what they believed was the end of her usefulness had instead delivered her into the one inheritance that mattered. And in the house nobody wanted on the forgotten property they had laughed at over a yellow deed in a lawyer's office on the worst morning of her life, Margaret Holloway built the one thing money could never purchase and cruelty could never accurately measure. Outside, as the autumn dark came early and the porch light clicked on, a car pulled to the shoulder of the road near the wooden sign. A woman stepped out. She was perhaps 50, with a coat too thin for the weather and a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. With her other hand, she held the wrist of a teenage girl who stood close enough to touch her mother's sleeve, but far enough away to pretend she was not afraid. They looked at the sign. They looked at the lit windows. They looked at each other. Then they walked up the path. Margaret saw them from the kitchen. She set down her tea. She did not wait for the knock. She had learned from a woman she had never known well enough, a woman whose hands were strong and who never touched anything timidly, that the most important door in the world is the one you open before anyone has to ask. She crossed the front room. She turned the handle, and she opened the door.